Hi, I'm Brandon Bowers, pastor of New Life Church, located in Locust, North Carolina. And I wanted to say thanks for stopping by and checking out our YouTube channel. I hope that today's message is both encouraging and challenging to you and your walk with Christ. If you're in our area sometime, we would love to have you come check out one of our services, each and every Sunday at 8:45, 10:15, and 11:45. We'd love to have you come out. And I hope that you enjoy today's message.
All right, well, good morning and happy Mother's Day to all of you who are mothers. All right, so we're so glad you're here and spend part of your day here with us. Because you're mothers and you are the most responsible one in the family, right? Can I get an amen for that? Right. All right, good. Your responsibility, Tony mentioned, please, if you're a regular attendee of New Life, to fill out the Fellowship One card. That's a sort of dark reddish card that was sitting in your seat. Take time to fill that out before you leave today. What we're trying to do is we've got a new database going, and we need to try to put your names in that, your family information in that, so that we can better minister to you and stay in contact with you. We would love to be able to call you by name, and with 3 services and people coming in and out, it's sometimes hard to do that. So we want to know you better and serve you better. So if you'll do that, load all that information up. It's also, you can go in there and you can load a picture, a photo of each person in your family so that we can recognize you, put a face with the name. So just help us do that and fill that out for us. If you're a guest with us here this morning, then if you'll open up your series folder, you'll notice in there's another card. It's called a connection card. We'd like for you to fill that out if you don't mind. Just give all of those to one of our volunteers before you leave today so that we know that you were here and we can share our appreciation with you. So for mothers, sort of in honor and to celebrate the occasion of Mother's Day, we want to start a new series today out of the book of Ruth. And so if you want to go ahead and find in your Bible the book of Ruth, that would be great. If you go to the Old Testament, you'll find Joshua, Judges, and then the book of Ruth. It's a very short 4-chapter book. And so we're going to spend the next few weeks there. And I thought it would be appropriate to start this series in the book of Ruth on Mother's Day because the book of Ruth is actually one of 2 books of the Bible that has as its title a female name. Only one of 2. And then Ruth herself is one of only 3 females mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus found like in Matthew, the 1st chapter of Matthew. So she's a prominent figure. She's a prominent woman and holds a special place in the Scripture. And so we find in her, and this is the thing, at the end of the book, this is so interesting. The reason she's in the genealogy of Jesus, just sort of put her in place as far as history. At the end of the book, we find out that she marries a guy named Boaz. They have a son, named him Obed. He's the father of Jesse, who is the father of King David. We know that Jesus comes from the line and lineage of King David, which makes Ruth the great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. So like I said, very special woman in Scripture. And we find her story just fascinating. It's a story that reminds us of God's love, God's faithfulness to us no matter what. In Ruth, the woman and the book, several things we learn. I mean, one, that it doesn't matter what life has thrown at you, what your circumstances are, you can always rely on God's faithfulness. You can always rely on Him and trust Him to provide whatever need that you have. It reminds us that if we'll just learn from and lean on His provision and His promise, that no matter what happens in our life, He's got it. He's in control. And everything will work out for our good. And it also reminds us that no matter what we've done and where we've been in life, that it's not too late to do the right thing, to make the right decision. Even if you've made some bad choices in the past, and you're trying to live down that regret, it's not too late. It's not too late to turn your life around today. That's what we find in the book of Ruth. But like most circumstances, like most stories, we find the book of Ruth opening with a crisis. It's chaotic. It's a difficult time. There's some difficult choices, and that's why I wanted to start out our 4 weeks through the book of Ruth talking today about the crossroads of crisis. The crossroads of crisis. See, often we find ourselves at points along life's path that are like a crossroad. We have a difficult decision to make. And whatever decision, whatever choice we make, whatever action we take at that crossroad will set our life off into a certain direction, good or bad. Whatever decision we make, it will perhaps change our life and the direction of our life for the next 5, 10, maybe 15, 20 years or more. That one moment, right? And so we have these choices that we make all along life's road. And it's at those points where we have to decide, am I going to follow God? Am I going to trust God? Am I going to believe and trust in His faithfulness to me, or am I going to go my own way? Am I going to make my own choices? Am I going to forge my own path and sort of be a self-made kind of a person? And when you get to a moment like that, what one person considers a crisis may not necessarily constitute as a crisis for the next person. But the thing is, they all share that common thread that it can change and direct the course of your life. Like for me, when I was going through high school, I entered in at sort of a crossroad kind of a time in my life then, and I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as a crisis, but the decision that I had to make at that time in my life would definitely dictate and have an effect or an impact on the rest of my life. You see, at age 14, right before I went into high school, I knew God had put a call on my life to preach the gospel. I knew it. It was absolutely evident to me. And I went into high school never shrinking back from what God really wanted me to do. I was never embarrassed or ashamed about that in any way. But inwardly, it wasn't from other people, but inwardly, I began to feel a pressure to try to fulfill God's will and plan for my life in my own way. I had other interests. I was really big into business and entrepreneurship. That kind of thing just really interested me and fascinated me. And I thought, if I could take what I want to do and mix it with what God wants me to do, that's got to be a good thing, right? That's got to work. And so I had in mind, I'm going to go through high school, and I took every, introductory business type class that was offered in high school. And I come up with this grand idea. You guys are going to love it. And you're going to think, why didn't you go through this? But I had this grand idea for a Christian nightclub. Like, isn't that awesome? Like, that is sick, And it was going to be a place, it was called The Alternative. And altar was spelled like a church altar, The Alternative. And it was going to be a safe place for young, for students and for young singles to come, mingle, get to know each other without the prevailing presence like drugs, alcohol, sex, all that kind of stuff. I thought it was going to be great. I was going to make lots of money, and I was going to be able to be technically in ministry, right? Sort of. I just thought that was a great idea, and that's what I had my mind set on. I actually got a $5,000 scholarship from a business class because I had to write a 5-year business plan and everything for it, and won the scholarship. It was a great idea. So I go into college with all of that on my mind, thinking what I need to do is just graduate, get my degree, get out, and I'll get this thing off the ground. It's going to be a huge success. Well, without getting into all the details, long story short, God wasn't having it. He just wasn't going to have it. Wasn't tolerating that idea. And I was faced with a decision. I was standing at that crossroad. Am I going to do and follow the path that God has laid out for me and what I believe He wants me to do? Or am I going to go my own way and try to fulfill His plan for my life in my own kind of way? Luckily, fortunately for me, I believe I chose the right thing. I did things God's way. I said, okay, I get it, God. Most likely, I'm going to fall on my face. It's going to be a huge failure if I try to do things my own way. I'll just do things your way. And then if it don't work out, I'll blame you. Well, what did I have to lose, right? But I did things God's way. Now I look back and I realize that was the dumbest idea. Who would a Christian nightclub? That was just stupid, right? And it was destined to fail before it ever got off the ground. But that's, when you're at a moment of crisis, most of the time you're not thinking clearly. And you got several options to weigh, and there's a lot of pressure involved. There's a lot of stress, and sometimes we make the wrong decision. In the book of Ruth, like I said, it starts out, and it's set in a chaotic time in Israel's history. It's during the up and down, back and forth, faithful one minute, rebellious the next period of Israel's history called the period of the Judges. That's what the book right before Ruth is called, the book of Judges. It's before Israel ever had their first king, and they had this pattern going on that sometimes they would be faithful to God, and then they would fall into idolatry and disobedience and so on and so forth. And God would raise up an individual called a judge. And this person would be responsible for calling Israel out on their sin and leading them back into right relationship with God, where they needed to be. And then they would usually see things begin to in a positive way, begin to happen. Typically, they would stray again, and that whole process is just over and over and over the same thing. Sometimes, to get the people's attention, God might send, pestilence, disease, disaster upon them. There may be an invading nation to come upon them and sort of oppress them for several hundred years or whatever it might be. And in the book of Ruth, it starts out in one of those times. God is judging them. And it's a time of famine. And it's at this moment that we see several different people in the book of Ruth respond to this crisis, the very same crisis, in different ways. And what that does for us, on the backside of this, is gives us the opportunity to look back and say, okay, well, how did that work out for them? How did their response and their decision in that moment work out? And is that something I need to do? Whose example do I need to follow? And so we're going to look at three different people here this morning, three different responses, and try to decide for ourselves what's going to be the best decision for us, for me, when I enter or face my next crossroad of crisis. So if you got your place in Ruth chapter 1, let's look at verses 1 through 5. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." All right, let's just stop there for a moment, because we already see the first decision at this crossroad of crisis. The book of Ruth opens, and the first person that we're introduced to is not Ruth, but her father-in-law, Elimelech. And we see him, he's standing at this crossroad. He's got a decision to make. It's a crisis kind of time in his life. And what we see from him, this is our first option if you want to take notes, is Elimelech's delusion. He makes a decision for he and his family out of a state of delusion. Because not only is this a dark time spiritually for the nation, but like I said, there's a famine in the land. And now I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and agree that, hey, if any of us were to find ourselves in a similar situation where our families are struggling to put food on the table, most of us, as responsible adults and parents, are going to do whatever we need to do to make sure our families are provided for, right? I mean, whatever the cost, whatever the risk, we'll probably do that. However, are we willing to go so far as to compromise, to sacrifice our belief, our hope, and our trust in God's faithfulness in exchange to do our own thing, to provide for ourselves? Because that's what we see Elimelech doing. Instead of doing all he can do, but saying and staying in one place saying, God, I trust you, I know you're going to provide for us, he decides to go extreme. And we're just going to see how extreme that is here in a minute. You got to keep in mind, he and his family, they're living in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is really the center of what was called the Promised Land. It was the land that God had brought his people from Egypt to. And he promised them in Deuteronomy chapter 28, get this, he says, when you enter this land, if you'll be careful to obey me, to keep all of my commands, I'll bless you. I'll do everything in my power to bless every part of your life if you just be faithful to me and if you'll trust me. However, in the very same chapter, he says, if you're unfaithful to me, if you disobey, you don't keep my laws and my decrees, then I'll have to punish you. I'll bring upon you disaster, curses, hardship, oppression. And this is exactly what they're experiencing. However, even in that, God said, if you find yourselves in one of these, rebellious seasons and you're under duress, all you have to do is repent, confess your sin, and immediately the hardship that you're going through, I will lift it and bless you again. So Elimelech doesn't have to pick up his family and move and go anywhere. As a nation, they need to simply pull together, repent of their sin, and trust God's faithfulness. Lean on His promises. But that's not what he does. He decides to leave that land. Instead of trusting God, leave that land and go to a place where apparently he believes that he and his family, under their own power, are going to be better off. Now, here's what's interesting. When you begin to study passages like this, and you start looking at the people's names and the places, the names of places, and what those names mean, in their own way, a lot of times they tell the story. It's so interesting. I just want to listen for a second, and let's go through some of these names. This father-in-law, husband, Elimelech, his name means, my God is king. All right, just remember that. My God is king. He's living in Bethlehem with his family. He's got a wife and got 2 kids, Naomi, which means joyfulness or pleasantness. He's got 2 kids, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, why you would name your kids this, I don't know, but here's what their names mean. One means sickly, and one means wasting away. Right? Maybe their nicknames like puny. Little puny over here, little piney over here, little pukester, whatever. That's it. That was their name, little sickly little boys. And they're living in Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. And they decide to move to Moab, which means the field. All right, so if you take all of those names and those meanings and you put them together, here's sort of the story of just the first 5 verses. You have this man who professes that God is his king. God is the Lord of his life. He has a joyful and pleasant wife with 2 kids, though they're not in the greatest of health. But he decides for their future, what's better for them is that they move from the house of bread to the field to provide for themselves. Now, does that sound like something that's going to be successful? It doesn't to me, right? It sounds delusional. It sounds delusional. It sounds insane. Because rather, if you read the rest of the story, rather than being better off, they continue to struggle. And even worse, they get there, the husband dies. Some years later, the 2 boys, they die. And Naomi, she goes from being this joyful and pleasant woman to when later on in the book, she returns back from Moab to Bethlehem. She doesn't want people to call her Naomi anymore. She wants them to call her Mara, which means bitter. So in this place, through this experience, because of the decision, the delusional decision of her husband, she goes from being, hey, we got this, the kids, they aren't in greatest of health, but we're a happy, pleasant family. Now I am a bitter, angry widow. See, it just doesn't work out right. And we think that that's insane. I don't see why he would do that. But oftentimes at a crossroad, we think the same delusional way. Oh, I can make it on my own. If God's not going to provide, if God's not going to do what I think He needs to do right here in this situation, then I'll make my own way. I'm a go-getter. I can make things happen. I just need to get out there and get after it. I can do and provide for myself. It's delusional to think that our plans can outsatisfy and outperform God's plans for us. That's insane. That's crazy. So that's one option, though. I mean, you can follow this man's example. But let's just take Naomi, all right? Because she's standing at the same crossroads. And she makes a decision as well out of a certain place in her life. Is her option any better for us? She doesn't make a decision out of delusion, but maybe just as dangerously, she makes her decision out of despair. And so when we're standing at a crossroad, we could do the same. We could make a decision out of desperation, just grasping at straws. See, it says that they've been living in this area for about 10 years. The boys, they both married Moabite women, which according to the law wouldn't necessarily have been forbidden, but it probably would have been frowned upon. And then for whatever reason, again, at separate times, the father dies, and then the two sons die. And so you have Naomi, she's a widow. She's lost not only her husband, but both of her sons. And then the two women that they married, they're widowed as well. It's a pretty desperate situation. And now here's what we need to watch and read what happens here. We're going to read a little bit, verse 6 through 15. And we see in these verses sort of a recurring theme. And I just want to see if you pick up on it, because this seems to be the time in her life where she begins this transition from being a joyful and pleasant woman named Naomi to the bitter and angry woman whose name or who wants to be called Mara. So just follow along and see if you notice a trend here. Verse 6, it says, "When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. And with her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home, and may the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each one of you will find rest in the home of another husband.' Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and she said to her, 'We will go back with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters, for I'm too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me.' At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. 'Look,' said Naomi, 'your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her.'" Sort of a reoccurring statement coming from Naomi, right? Go back. Don't follow me. Don't do that. This is not a good decision for you. This woman, her faith is absolutely a wreck. She's a wreck. She's falling apart. And rather than meeting her crisis, facing this challenge with faith and reliance upon God and His faithfulness and His goodness to her, she's speaking, thinking, and acting out of total despair and hopelessness. This is a woman, now we'll give her a little bit of grace, right? She's a woman, she's lost her husband. She's lost both of her sons. She's in a pretty desperate situation. But rather than speaking words of faith, she speaks words of despair. Rather than speaking from the place, from a woman who claims to know and trust and believe in the living God, it sounds as if she has no faith at all, that she has no relationship with God at all. And not only that, she's acting this way in front of two of her daughters-in-law, who at this point, from any indication in the story, there's no relationship with God. They don't know God. They came from a pagan background. I mean, this is her opportunity. I mean, she is standing at a great opportunity. She has a captive audience, so to speak, where she can have a great influence and speak words of faith and be positive, but instead she does the exact opposite. She could have seized this moment and said, you know what, girls? I believe in God. I believe He is a good God. I believe that He will provide for my every need abundantly. And I'm going to follow His plan for my life. You know, my husband, God rest his soul, he shouldn't have led us here. I mean, we shouldn't even be here. And so now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. I'm going to go back to the place where I believe God intended for us to be all along, and I'm going to trust Him to meet my needs. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to trust and believe God with me. And I want you to go with me. See, she could have done that. She could have had a huge influence on their lives, but instead, at every opportunity she was given, she says, don't follow me. Go back. Return home. Go back to your home, your gods, your way of life. Forget all this ever happened. You wouldn't want to follow me. Why would anybody want to follow me? Why would anybody want to trust my God? Look, He hadn't provided for me yet. My whole life's falling apart. Words of disparity rather than words of faith. And I read this and I'm thinking, what in the heck is happening with this woman? It absolutely sounds ridiculous and it's really sad. But many times in a moment of crisis, if we'll pay attention to what we're thinking and saying and doing, it sounds like Naomi. Sounds like Naomi. Instead of believing and trusting in God's faithfulness and His love for us, we begin to look around and, our life seems like it's falling apart. And we just give way to it. We give in to that mentality. The doctor gives us a bad report, and instead of believing God for healing and confessing words of healing over our life and believing in faith that He can do anything, we start planning our funeral. Right? That's what we do, right? A spouse walks out on us or abandons us, and instead of believing God to restore a marriage, instead of running into the arms of God, what do? We run into the arms of another man or another woman, and that typically happens over and over and over. But that plan doesn't work. That plan doesn't satisfy. It's a plan and it's action taken out of desperation. And what desperation does is eat away at our faith and our intimacy with God. Not only does it negatively affect our relationship with God, but it says to everybody else around us, everybody that's watching our lives, that our God can't be trusted. We're saying to them exactly what Naomi said to these two young women. You can't trust my God. You don't want to follow Him because look at the mess I'm in. I trusted Him. Look where that got me. That's crazy, man. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like this husband who acted out of a state of delusion, or like Naomi who acted out of despair. So there's got to be another option. There's got to be a better way, a path that I can choose when I'm standing at a crossroad that's going to work out much better than what these seem to be. And the crazy thing is that you find that better way in Ruth. Ruth, a Gentile woman with a pagan background, we find a faith-filled and God-honoring response to the crisis, the very same crisis that these other two individuals are facing. And what we see in Ruth is just sheer determination. I'm going to follow God. I'm going to trust God no matter what. Now, from Ruth, from her mouth come the most powerful, God-honoring words I think could ever be spoken. Naomi's been urging these two girls to go back, back to their homes, to their own gods, and it says they weep together for a little while, and Ruth clings to her mother-in-law, and in response to those suggestions to go back, she says this, listen, in verse 16, she says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me.
And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Now, you'll remember I said something about, it's interesting, you got people's names and places and what they mean. You have these two daughters-in-law. Again, they're facing the same crisis that everybody else is, the same crisis that Naomi's facing. There's a famine. They've all lost husbands. They're in a desperate situation. Ruth, her name means friendship. She's a faithful friend. Orpah, the other sister-in-law, her name means stiff-necked. She's like stubborn. She's hard-headed. She's going to go her own way. And indeed she does. No thanks to her mother-in-law and these suggestions to go back, she says, well, you know what? You're probably right. Why would I want to follow your God? Hasn't worked out so great for you yet, so I'm going to go back to my family. I'm going to forget all this ever happened, and I'm going to go back to my gods and so on and so forth. And you go do and live your life happily ever after. Probably a decision that she regretted and that she ultimately had to pay for the rest of eternity. She rejected God. Ruth, on the other hand, despite the discouragement from her mother-in-law, she determined in her heart that she had seen enough to realize that for her life, she was going to be much better off. There was more hope to be had. There was more promise to hang on to by following God and trusting in His faithfulness than there was to try to go her own way and make things happen for herself, reverting back to what she had always done and where she had always been, what she had always known. Was it an easy decision? Absolutely not. Probably one of the most difficult decisions that she ever made in her life, because it meant that she was going to have to leave her family. She was going to have to renounce the gods of her family, her nation, everything she'd ever known. And then after that, she, by just nothing on just faith, she's going to have to literally sort of walk with God, accompanied by her bitter, angry mother-in-law for 100 miles over mountainous terrain to get from Moab to Bethlehem. But she said, if that's what it takes to follow God, that's what I'm going to do. Because I believe my life's going to be better off for it. I don't know what awaits me in Bethlehem, but I know it's better than what awaits me if I go back. Because I believe I can trust God. See, it's amazing. It's an amazing story. And with the exception of being a woman, I would love to be like Ruth. I mean, she's just awesome, right? I want to stand at no matter what crossroad comes my way, whatever difficulty or chaos God allows to take place in my life, I want to stand there and say, you know what, I can trust God. I don't know what my future holds, but, cliche as it may sound, I know who holds the future. I know I can trust God to provide for me. His plan for my life is going to be so much better than anything I can come up with for myself on my best day. Don't you want to be like that? Follow God's faithfulness. Trust God's faithfulness and His love for you.